Hi everyone, we're just going to give people 1 or 2 more minutes and we'll be starting. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our final Design Lives 2020 Symposium event. Today is our keynote presentation. I'm very excited to have the CEO from the Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority here. Before I introduce her, I am going to start, as we have with each session, with a land acknowledgement. The City of Toronto takes its name from an Indigenous word, Toronto, which describes where there are trees standing in water. Today, where the University of Toronto is now located, has been the territory of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy of Six Nations, and more recently, this is also the territory of Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit, who are a part of the Anishinaabe Nation. Today, Toronto is still home to Indigenous, Inuit, and Métis people. And as we close our session for this year, I think it is important that we pause, acknowledge, and thank the peoples whose territory we are able to live and thrive on. And more than this, we should pledge that we turn our acknowledgement into action to be partners with them in caring for the land and water. So, as I said, today is our keynote address. I'm very excited to have with us Ms. Chandra Sharma, who is the Chief Administrative Officer of Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority, or NPCA for short, and a professional planner. She has over 20 years of progressive leadership experience in strategy, governance, operations, and program development. Ms. Sharma's program profile ranges from a variety of areas such as climate change, watershed management, and stakeholder relations. She is a recipient of the Canadian Institute of Planners Planning Excellence Award and has served on several expert committees and boards. The Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority is a watershed-based agency established under the Conservation Authorities Act of the Province of Ontario and undertakes programs and services to further the conservation, restoration, development, and management of natural resources. The NPCA is one of 36 conservation authorities in the province of Ontario and manages 41 conservation areas within the Niagara Peninsula watershed, held in public trust for recreation, heritage preservation, conservation, and education. So I'm thrilled and welcome, Chandra. It's fantastic to have you with us this morning. So we'll just have your camera turned on and your mic unmuted, and then we'll get going.
Thank you, Professor Drake, for the introduction. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this very progressive and timely dialogue on living green infrastructure. The focus of my discussion today will be about our watersheds as living green infrastructure. A majority of our watersheds in Ontario are managed by conservation authorities, as you've heard, and mine is the Niagara Peninsula. Prior to that, I was with the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority. Today in my presentation, I will focus on some of the challenges and opportunities facing our urban watersheds and their form and function. I'll also be sharing some groundwork and strategies being deployed to build these green infrastructure resources as resilient systems. But before I start this morning, I would like to show you a short video. The video will set the context for my presentation and also provide you with a high-level view of what kind of work or activities take place within these organizations called conservation authorities for the sustainable management of our watersheds, which are the ecosystems that support green infrastructure for our big cities and communities and urban areas. So with that, I will ask the organizer to play a little video, and then I'll get started with my presentation. Thank you.
The Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority, or NPCA for short, is dedicated to not only protecting the watershed of the Niagara Peninsula, but restoring nature and educating the next generation. Here are some of the amazing staff we have working with us.
My name is Steve Gillis. I'm a restoration project lead.
I'm Stuart McPherson. I'm also a restoration project lead. I joined the NPCA almost 4 years ago. And it was kind of a continuation of the work I'd been doing, working in restoration, habitat restoration, environmental restoration. And it was a really good opportunity to kind of work back at home in Niagara. Ducks Unlimited came in the winter of 2019 and dug this. The landowners here were really keen on adding more habitat to their land and trying to get back a little bit more to the nature in Niagara. And this is one of the things we did. We're planting a mixture of quick growing things that will provide shade, and things like cottonwoods, dogwoods, and willows, and these things will actually hold the soil. They'll grow, the roots will grow and hold the soil as well. The other thing we're planting are some things that will be here a lot longer, things like oaks and maples, and even some sycamores. And these trees will take a long time to get big, but they'll be around for a long time. I mean, an oak could live to be 900 years old. We only get a couple of opportunities to come to a property when we work with them, so we try to get as much done as we can and try to make a long-term plan for how it's going to look in the next not only 10 to 15 years, but what it's going to look like in 50 years.
I joined the Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority as an ecologist to deal with plants and animals and help improve the environment. There's a variety of different species at risk. At one of our sites, we have eastern Massasauga rattlesnakes. We also have red mulberry trees and a variety of other species as well. The Wingfleet Bog is the largest bog in southern Ontario. It's over 3,000 acres. Our property is roughly 2,000 acres. There is a narrow gauge railway system in the bog here, and what they used that for was to transport the peat. They put it on the railway system back out to the parking lot where they had a processing plant. Some of the invasives here are the European birch tree, as well as a little bit of Phragmites. The water wells at our site we installed to monitor the groundwater system. As part of our restoration program, we wanted to see whether we're meeting our goal, which is whether the water is close to or at the surface. What I would like people to know about this site is its significance. It's a bog ecosystem, which is a vegetative community that we don't have a lot of in this particular area, and it has value by improving the air and the water for the area residents.
My job mainly encompasses is I am in control of the educational programming that we run here at Balls Falls. I love this job because I get the ability to teach about nature in nature, being fully immersed in it. We always start with a short indoor presentation just to get students thinking about the sorts of concepts we're going to be talking about on our hike. So we took them through the trail, we got them immersed in their senses, they were feeling moss on rock. So the fact that I get to show real life examples and have students outside just makes me so excited to share my wealth of knowledge with them and inspire a love of nature. This role looks after all of our services that we provide out of our conservation areas, including our educational programs, historical tours, environmental education and interpretation, as well as the activities that we put on. One of the things that we're conveying with our outdoor education is that there is so much to learn from our environment, so much to learn within our watershed. So we see thousands of folks throughout the year, which is really exciting that we're sharing the news with students across the Niagara region, as well as students that visit us from areas like Hamilton and Haldimand as well. Our days are very diverse here and very exciting. So we can either be back in time in our heritage village or in our boots along the trails exploring our environment.
I have to do a daily planning cycle, so I look at the weather, I look at all the water levels within local creeks, see how much rain we've had in the past 24, 48 hours, and I also maintain a hydrometric network, which is what we see here today. So all this data that we're collecting through these stations gets posted real time to our website. This station here is monitoring air temperature and water temperature as well as water level. So if you do have a resident that's living close to a creek and they're concerned, they can go to our website. Typically, we want to be proactive in our flood duties. So we try to keep people away from the hazard, not the hazard away from people.
My job is to implement the water quality program, and that essentially means that I monitor the streams, creeks, and rivers in Niagara. And this includes surface water, groundwater, and biological monitoring. So this is the upper 12-mile creek, which is the only cold water, groundwater fed stream that we have left in Niagara. And what that means is that the groundwater is influencing the creek, and it means that the creek stays cooler in the summer and it stays a little bit warmer in the winter, so it won't freeze over. And that's really important for certain species that live here. For example, we have brook trout here. Brook trout are rare in Niagara. This is the only creek that can support a brook trout. Biological sampling is just another way of testing the water quality. So we know what bugs are sensitive and what bugs can tolerate pollution. Sometimes for water quality, we can also use what we call probes or sondes. And what they are probes that sit in the water, and they can read off in real time what's going on in the creek. We have a lot of programs, a lot of education programs for landowners as well, how to have less impact on the creek. So if you have a creek running through your property, you don't want to, mow down everything right to the edge of the creek. You want to let things grow around it.
As you can see, we've got a number of knowledgeable and passionate people working at the NPCA to make our watershed a better place. Our dedicated staff built relationships with community groups, volunteers, and partners, and together we have achieved great results. We planted over 57,000 trees in 2019, reforesting almost 26 hectares of land, and created 2 hectares of wetlands that will provide habitat for wildlife and water quality benefits. Our programs educate close to 6,500 children, inspiring the next generation to be kind to the environment and to be curious about nature. We love this community and work hard to keep our watershed beautiful, healthy, and resilient while keeping people and their property safe.
Welcome, everyone. Am I showing my screen now?
Not yet, Chandra. You just probably have to confirm that you want to take over the screen.
I did that. There you go. Is it better now? No?
Yep. Presentation mode, and then you're good to go.
Perfect. So welcome back, everyone. Let me start with giving you, I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me start with giving you a bit of an overview of, what these watershed and conservation authorities in Ontario are all about. There are 36 conservation authorities, as you can see from this map. Most of these conservation authorities in the Southern Ontario area are highly urbanized. They support, in Ontario overall, most conservation authorities together support a population of almost 95% of Ontario's population is living in one or the other watersheds. Many of these conservation authorities, especially the one I come from, are influenced and influence the Great Lakes. So for instance, the Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority has Lake Ontario on one side and Lake Erie on one side. So what happens on the land reflects in the lake, and what happens in the lake with extreme weather events and high winds reflects on the land. And I'm going to talk more about it. These conservation authorities are mandated to undertake watershed-based programs to protect people and property from flooding and other natural hazards, and to conserve natural resources for economic, social, and environmental benefits. The other important facts about conservation authorities is that they own and manage a lot of land. In some areas, they are the largest landowners, and this land is secured in public ownership for people to enjoy and for the for habitat in the watersheds. Now, together, these conservation authorities also own 3.8 billion worth of flood control and prevention infrastructure, which includes almost 900 flood and erosion control structures, dams, dikes, channels, etc. What's interesting about these structures is some of these are associated with hazard land, and the land that was acquired for flood management purposes. And the surrounding land is now in public ownership and forms a lot of green space in Ontario. So this forward thinking at the time really helped us create some of the much needed green space today that our communities enjoy. And some of these, lands are valleys and streams, as you've seen in Toronto. Some areas, these are large conservation parks. You've probably seen one of them or been in one of them. And they are very good for passive and active recreation, both purposes. Now, on the right side of the screen, you'll see a map of the Niagara Watershed. So what I'm trying to explain here is watersheds are formed, and the management we do is based on ecological boundaries that does not go with the municipal lines or municipal boundaries. And why that's important is because water doesn't understand municipal boundaries, both surface and groundwater, and it flows within a watershed and drains into the receiving water body, whether it's the lake or the big river. If you look at the map on the right side of the screen, you'll see the jurisdiction of Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority. The reason why I wanted to show you is to show you the complexity of governance and the geography of a watershed. So in Niagara Peninsula Watershed, you're talking about approximately 138 small streams and watersheds and big rivers like the Niagara River. You've seen the Niagara Falls. We have Niagara Escarpment. We have two Great Lakes, one Lake Erie, Ontario, and we also have the largest and the most significant Ontario tender fruit belt in Ontario. So you have to understand the amount of land owners and land users we have to work with as organizations to protect the watershed. You're talking industrial, commercial, you're talking agriculture, you're talking residential, and then natural spaces, and deal with different layers of municipalities. So in Niagara alone, you have 12 local municipalities, 3 regional municipalities, Hamilton, Haldimand, and Niagara region. And then there's another layer of governance from the province of Ontario and the federal government, Niagara Parks Commission. So all these other agencies that are also responsible for managing green space. Now, you see a lot of green space on this map, but I must remind you that it's good to have all these green space, but not all this green space is in public ownership, meaning some of this is agriculture land, other is in private ownership. And that's the major issue we are dealing with about stewardship. When you have such important land in private ownership, collaboration with various stakeholders and stewardship of land is very, very important to preserve your green infrastructure. So moving on to slide 3 to just give you a general overview of water management in Canada and the evolution of these organizations in Ontario. Conservation authorities are very unique to Ontario. No other jurisdiction or province in Canada has conservation authorities. And it has really served really well for the province of Ontario, this model that I'm talking about. So in Canada, the responsibility for water management is shared by federal, provincial, and municipal governments. And in Ontario, the province has uniquely delegated some watershed management responsibilities through the creation of the Conservation Authorities Act, and that was in 1946. So this provincial legislation has enabled municipalities back then to recommend and the creation of conservation authority. So municipalities ask the province to create a conservation authority in their area, and they come together to support the conservation authorities, and that model's really worked well. The success of Ontario Conservation Authority can be traced back to 1941 or the early 40s, when like-minded people got together in Guelph and said, okay, we are losing a lot of land to unsustainable agriculture, soil erosion, and other forestry practices, unrestricted floodplain development, and this is not good for our future, and we need to do something about it. So as a result, conservation authorities came to being, and that's when the Conservation Authorities Act came into play in 1946. Now, as the time passed and we've seen Hurricane Hazel in the 50s, the responsibility and regulatory responsibility of these conservation authorities evolved over the course of time, and the adaptive management approach to managing our watershed also evolved with that. And today, the benefits provided by Conservation Authority watershed management programs have been successfully leveraged across the province to achieve many federal, provincial objectives around water management, climate change, Great Lakes management, protection of biodiversity, source water protection, drinking water source protection, sustainable agriculture, and also helping with sustainable growth management. So if you go to slide 4 here, with the evolution of Conservation Authority, the approach within the watershed for the management of floodplains also evolved over the past few decades to accommodate the dynamic river systems. In the early years of conservation authorities, to find development opposite rivers or closer to the rivers was commonplace. Hurricane Hazel, the big storm, influenced this, and it focused on, when Hurricane Hazel came, I think the focus was on flood management to create hardened infrastructure, and by that I mean the dams and the channels. So the prevailing ideology at that time and the direction was largely an engineering-based approach to acquire major chunks of flood susceptible land, and major engineering works took place throughout the 60s and 70s. What was also happening, our cities were growing in that time period, and we were building a lot of infrastructure. So a lot of channels were also built to encase the river to accommodate big infrastructures like highways and other things. But over the course of time, it was understood that this type of approach was not financially viable and not always environmentally desirable. Today we know that the best policy and approach is to allow the river to move where it wants to move and give it enough room to retain water and do its job. Let nature do its course. So our practice, there were several dams built across Ontario on the land acquired. And some of these dams are still there and they provide a much needed green space for communities. However, the whole practice has changed now to natural channel design, better floodplain management, and providing the river more room to meander. Now, what also happened with the evolution of Conservation Authority and creation of conservation authorities, They were given the power to regulate, or I would say protect, some of the features in these watersheds. And these features include your shorelines, your watercourses, wetlands, buffers to the wetlands, and stream corridors. And in a way, that was a very forward-thinking and progressive approach. Because of that, we now have a lot of green infrastructure in our watersheds intact. So the land that was acquired, I mentioned, and the green space we have now, these natural areas of our watersheds, are also treasures, not just for their, beauty, people go enjoy green space, but also in the changing climate to attenuate flood water, storm water, infiltrate groundwater, improve air and water quality, provide shade and cooling from heat, and also provide habitat for important species. And then for the communities, provide public realm opportunities, a sense of place, and recreational opportunities for physical and mental health. And that connection is very evident now, and there's a lot of research among the academic sector is going on to prove that there is a connection there between green spaces and public health and social benefits coming from that. So we have all these green spaces, we have our watersheds. Watersheds are regulated, and we do have floodplain mapping where we do not allow development within the flood-prone areas and keep people away. But the reality is, before Conservation Authority came into play in around 1946 and after, we have communities that were built before that when there was no regulation, and we have people living in floodplains. We have people living in flood-prone areas in Ontario. And these communities were not designed to deal with the kind of extreme weather we are seeing now. So we're seeing a lot of challenges within our watersheds. And we've seen ongoing urbanization on top of that. So we're seeing urbanization and intensification in our urban areas. We're seeing effects of climate change, which are resulting in huge vulnerability and risks to our natural infrastructure. But what we are also seeing with that is an opportunity, and there's two specific ones that I want to talk about in context of green infrastructure. One is the reframing the discourse around watersheds and our green infrastructure and functions of watershed in a way that positions them as ecosystem services providers, and it elevates their value from a human health and well-being perspective. And it's being done to garner more attention to the importance of green infrastructure. And the other one is looking at extreme weather and climate change and coming up with strategies to support resilience within these systems. We know that recent climate change, there's a lot of studies going on in Canada and internationally with the International Panel on Climate Change. We know now the models, the climate models are predicting really well at more finer scales, local scales, regional. You can go down to the watershed scale as well to look at what your historical climate has been and what your future climate projections will look like. And we know in general that for this region, we are anticipating hotter summers with more heat waves and droughts, warmer winters with less snow and more rain and freezing rain, increase in extreme weather, including thunderstorms, tornadoes, and high winds. And all of these things do result in impacts to our natural systems. They do result in loss of infrastructure, as you can see from these slides, sewer backups, urban flooding in the urban areas, which is different from riverine flooding, but we're seeing impacts to both. We're seeing impacts to municipal infrastructure that cannot or wasn't designed to take this much water, but we're also seeing impacts on our river valleys where in some places people are already too close to the river and there is no room for river to move. Urban rivers are very flashy, they're very steep, and when we see extreme weather events with too much water in too little time, we see our rivers eroding and flashy floods in the river system. And also climate change is impacting our natural heritage system within our watersheds, changes to flora and fauna, infestation, disease, and the loss of natural infrastructure and changes to that infrastructure. So we think that our watersheds were already stressed with urbanization, and now with the changing climate, we will have more challenges in managing these living green infrastructure. So our challenge really is, how do we continue to urbanize and grow our communities and stay resilient to these type of impacts? So how do we cope? Multiple strategies are being deployed by practitioners, and they're being deployed at various scales of the watershed. You're talking watershed, then going into sub-watershed, catchment scale, neighborhood scale, and individual scale, what people can do on their own property, managing it effectively. You've seen things like downspout disconnection, like what can you do to manage water on your own individual property? Everything counts, everything contributes. So our strategies range from actually developing the science and evidence to inform that change is happening, and it's happening for a reason. Developing the tools to help practitioners understand the risk and vulnerability to the system so they can design the right policies and right programs. We're also undertaking a variety of projects at various scales, both municipalities and conservation authorities, to mitigate flood and advance resilience planning. And then there's a lot of pilot programs to share, to kind of monitor these practices and share the results in the market to increase uptake. And I'm sure throughout this session that you're having, you've heard many presentations that talk about sustainable technologies on the ground and what is being done to advance those. So I think one of the easiest thing to do in our watershed, and I'm a big proponent of 3 R's of our watershed planning, which is for healthy, resilient communities and attractive public realm. And like I said, we have to undertake action at various scale. And I'm in the next few slides, I'm going to talk about, to give you some examples of, how these strategies are being deployed at various scales and various land uses within the watersheds. So we can easily, as you know, some of the older areas of our watersheds are going through redevelopment and rebuilding. And we can integrate green elements into the development process and function of those development projects. And the scale can vary from urban riverway revitalization to small urban parks within the urban areas, neighborhood streetscapes and greenways and signature urban spaces. And these are good for society. So I say what's good for society also helps the economy and is good for the environment. So there is a strong business case to do these things right. Now, what's also happening to facilitate that is there is a increased understanding in the research and scientific community that we have limited space left in our urban systems, and it's critical to use that wisely, enhancing green infrastructure. And the science of natural system planning has evolved from just relying on natural areas to provide the desired ecosystem function to services to incorporating final levels of details on all forms of green infrastructure across the entire landscape to provide these ecosystem functions. And these vary from, if you look at this slide from your left, you're talking about a valley system or a natural park, natural open space. And as you move towards the city, you'll see small hedgerows in the agriculture communities, if I may say, community gardens, natural landscaping, bioswales, green streets along your urban neighborhoods, greenways, pollinator gardens at the neighborhood scales, green roofs, urban tree canopy, the street trees that you see in your communities, permeable paving, and stormwater ponds. So everything counts. All of them add to the ecosystem services and functions in the broader sense of the landscape. What's also happening in Ontario is some advancement on the policy side, and that's really really good in Ontario and Canada, also in North America. We have some of our leading municipalities, you may have heard, that have really advanced green infrastructure through a variety of tools. We have the provincial policy statement, climate change strategy in Ontario. Federal government was also recognizing living green infrastructure as a key strategy for their funding program. Ministry of Environment and also developing low impact development guidelines for construction. Our Great Lakes strategies also advance green infrastructure. The growth plan in Ontario was another policy document that clearly laid out, benefits of enhancing green infrastructure. And then I think we have some very advanced municipalities in Canada that they have stuff in their official plan policies, and they've created bylaw like the Green Development Bylaw in the City of Toronto, or the Green Roof Bylaw, and these kind of things really go a long way to help with the uptake of green infrastructure. Another very interesting thing that happened recently was the recognition that green infrastructures are important assets. And the Ontario regulation, I think it was 588 in 2017, that asked municipalities to include green infrastructure in asset management planning for municipalities. So that was really, really progressive and good. So now with the right policies, with the right science, we also have to move the market. So that's when it comes to proven technologies. How can you show progress on the ground for others to emulate that progress and increase the uptake? And I recognize some of this work, and the pictures I'm showing you may have been also presented to you by a Conservation Authority's Sustainable Technologies Evaluation Program. My colleagues there, thanks to them, I give them full credit for advancing this type of work in Ontario, working with the industry very closely. And what you're seeing on this slide is some of the green technologies that are being deployed across our watersheds to bring the form and function and manage some of the water on the ground before it goes into the storm sewer system. So what you're seeing on this slide are examples of biofilters, rainwater cisterns, bioswale, permeable pavers where the car is. That slide shows permeable pavement. And also a new trend of fitness paths and drainage swales, along the streets. So all of that is good information and progress. Again, this next slide is talking about low impact development on a very on a site scale. And this aerial view is the design for Toronto Edward Gardens in Toronto, where they have deployed green roof and rainwater harvesting systems. Again, I borrowed this from our STEP program, Sustainable Technologies program. And what's interesting to note is the same design, same rebuilding, but what they've done was, increase the percentage of permeable area from 89% asphalt to 50% asphalt. They reduced it. The lawn turned from 11% of lawn area to, creating 85 trees there from 20 trees. So those small measures really help create the pervious land area and reduce the amount of concrete we had on this site. Those are simple things that are easily doable and help the watersheds immensely. Again, this picture is from, example is from the Seasons Market in Portland. Bioswales ring this site, no sewer system here. Planters take road runoff and it goes into bioswales, and then road runoff into a bioretention cell with public art that you see on the top end of this slide. And this whole system helps with keeping water on the site. I picked the other example to show you the social economic benefits of green space, and this is a picture from Pat Stone Mental Health Foundation site in St. Catharines in Niagara region. And this shows the recognition of connections with mental health and social benefits of green infrastructure. They created a living space or a garden for their clients, the kids that come there with mental health issues. And basically it was designed with full sensory therapies in mind. And it's being used every day to provide the right environment for their residents and clients. I also wanted to show you an example of what can be done in our industrial commercial areas. As you can see from some of the watershed maps, I haven't shown you here, but you can go online and see the amount of industrial, commercial, or employment lands in our watersheds is vast. But we do need to support it. We don't need the economy to prosper. But how you design these industrial commercial areas in the watersheds is very, very important. Both at the design stage when you're designing the subdivision itself to reduce the concrete, but also at a business scale, what businesses can do themselves, because some of them have big box, centers or factories or you name it, warehouses and logistics centers. This is an example again from a industrial commercial business outreach project we did with Greater Toronto Airports Authority in my previous job called Partners in Project Green. And basically we worked with the businesses on this. This specific project is was implemented by a business called Callstone, small family-run business. What they did was, it's in Highland Creek in Scarborough. They took 44,000 square rooftop rainwater infiltration into a project and directed it to a nice living public realm space next to their facility. And this is a very confined small space between two businesses. And look what you can do when you do it right. All this water is coming from their rooftop, and I understand from reading the project summary that approximately 1.8 million liters of storm water has been diverted, going directly from the Highland into the Highland Creek, which is a very flashy river system. I spoke about natural channel design earlier, and this is an important strategy for some of the urban water courses. I talked about some of the rivers being encased in concrete to accommodate highways and other infrastructure and to make room for development. And this is our opportunity now to correct that. Some of this infrastructure, concrete lined channels, are coming to the end of their life cycle, and they are a serious threat to to downstream river system when they break and flow into the river or the channel. So we have an opportunity to look into that. And, you know, these type of projects are very popular now. They work really well. So if we removed and replaced these channels with natural channel features, they're better for the community, green space, watersheds, and habitat. So they have multiple benefits and important to do across our watershed to retain the form and function. So in closing, I want to bring home the point that urbanization and other stressors are impacting the form and function of our watersheds. And our watersheds are the greatest examples of living green infrastructure with multiple benefits to our cities and communities. We got to protect and enhance these ecosystems for their services they provide to all of us. And it has to be done at different scales with different land uses in mind and with different stakeholders. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you. And I think I'll hand it over to Jennifer to take any or suggest any questions at this point.
Thanks, Chandra. That was a great presentation. I really think there was a lot of really exciting examples. It's nice to see examples that are from just across Ontario, and I think it's very helpful for us to recognize the role that public policy has. You know, as this program focuses on design, you know, designers, whether they be architects or an engineer, ultimately are kind of, they design to the regulation. And so, you know, public policy and regulation needs to be progressive and really is an important part of, you know, making our entire communities more sustainable. So I'll remind all of our audience members to please enter in some questions now, and we have some time for Q&A. We have our first question comes from Sylvie. And she would like to know, how do conservation authorities interact with researchers? And as sort of follow-up to that, are there areas where the research community could explore further to advance the aims and objectives of CAs?
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, Sylvie. Very good question and very timely question, because this is the time when academic community can really help advance the understanding and focus their research on some of the key challenges. But just go back to how we collaborate with the academic community. I must say that conservation authorities are really solidly linked with the academic community. All 36 conservation authorities in Ontario working with their local academic partners. And some of the researchers are directly connected. I know of hundreds of examples where we have worked that we work collectively on NSERC and other research applications. Our benefit as practitioners is to make sure we direct the research in the right direction so the research can benefit us. So a small amount of time spent with the researchers in helping them get the topic right and get the outcomes right, it goes a long way for conservation authorities to advance that understanding. So that's designing the research, that's one area. And then from there, working with them as industry partners, because then the research can be applied in a real test ground, which is our watershed. So we've worked with many universities to undertake pilot projects or research projects, and I can give you hundreds of examples there as well. And then sharing the results of that research with the rest of the community, because you don't want to do research that sits at somebody's shelf. I think the important thing is the research to get out and translate it, because the scientific research sometimes does not make sense to many practitioners. I'm going to be very blunt. So it's important to take that research and translate that into simple information. So science needs to be translated, data needs to be translated, in terms of what does it mean for practitioners. And that's where conservation authorities are playing a major role, taking that research and translating that into action. And then working with researchers to influence policy. So taking it even further. But with this cycle comes another major responsibility that many conservation authorities have stepped up with, is providing our next generation of leaders, which are our students and researchers in universities, providing them the right opportunities to work with practitioners on the ground to help build their careers. So that's what conservation authorities are doing. You can go to any, I can tell you in Niagara, my team is working closely with Niagara College and Brock University to advance some of the work. When I was in Toronto, we had a very solid relationship with 5 or 6 or 8 universities called Ontario Climate Consortium. The consortium was built around engaging academic partners in climate change research to advance climate change planning in the GTA. So I hope I answered your question. Thank you.
Yeah, that was great. So my next question to you is water or conservation authorities, as an example of integrated watershed management, really do take a holistic approach to governance. And really encourage and implement a wide range of stakeholders. And one of the stakeholders for any community is, of course, their youth. So I was wondering if you could tell us the ways in which, since we have a number of students in the audience today, that students and young persons can become engaged in the watershed management of their local community.
I think there are many venues to get engaged for students. One is all the conservation authorities, as you know, we are small organizations, cash strapped. We rely on students to help us during the summertime. We have a lot of employment opportunities for students, ranging from park superintendents. In fact, just last weekend I was out at 3 or 4 Niagara parks, and I met so many students who keep coming back as seasonal employees working at conservation areas and learning from senior staff. That's a good career advancement opportunities. That's one. Seek summer employment. Every conservation authority hires students. Get engaged on research projects with your faculty that's working with conservation authority. And not only that, I think if you get connected with conservation authority staff, they can also connect you with the right municipal partners for folks who want to go influence municipal planning and municipal work. So that's another opportunity, opens up another opportunity there. I think youth need to also get engaged with conservation authorities that have public engagement programs. For instance, when I was at the Toronto Region Conservation Authority, we had a youth alliance. And basically what we are trying to do is, youth are really savvy with social media and other forms of engagement and communication, which some of the older generation is not. So you bring a lot to the table. You're valuable partners. And through the Youth Alliance, we've used a lot of youth to present or engage with the community on our behalf, engage with the next generation of youth. So you can do lots on your own by creating alliances and taking our message out into the communities and teaching people about protection of watersheds and climate change, but also get engaged with conservation authority for jobs and other activities. Thank you.
Sort of following up on that, this question is from Sylvia again. So given that, as you mentioned, CAs hire a lot of graduates, both at high school level or university level, but then also graduates from research programs, what advice would you offer to graduate students who are interested in careers with CAs in the future?
Well, first of all, if you're just starting with your school, make sure you network and find the right events to go to and seek advice from somebody who's working in the industry to design your future education program accordingly. So you have the right skills and right education and you're in the right direction. So that's one advice I'll give you. The second advice is when you're picking your projects, make sure you work with your advisor to pick the right project or research that is of value and that kind of sets you up for future work in that area. So you've done your research and now you're working on a project with real practitioners, out there in the field. So it's a multi-pronged strategy, and you cannot just finish your master's and go find a job in the industry. You have to start from the very beginning. When you put your first foot in the door at the academic institutions, the planning starts then. You have to be really progressive and proactive. You have to think through what are the issues, familiarize yourself with the issues, network, participate in presentations with experts to understand the issues, and instead of just picking something, pick an area of work that you think is going to benefit the industry and it's topical. So doing the right research, picking the right courses, working with the right people, and then eventually finding your foot in the door, because no job is small job. And let me tell you, I'm the CAO today. This is 22 years of career. I started with the Conservation Authority in 1998, planting trees, working as a stewardship coordinator. And my job was to engage people and go plant hundreds of trees. That was the beginning of my career. So no job is small job. Start somewhere, because every opportunity is a learning opportunity that advances you. Work hard, be genuine. Don't focus on where you want to be from a career perspective, but think about what impact do you want to make and what do you want to do. And those are important things. Once you have your headspace in that area, I'm sure you'll advance yourself really well and be successful in creating the impact you want to create, because environmental sector is one of those sectors where you don't go to make money. You go in this sector to make an impact. And I say to everyone, I feel very fortunate for 22 years, I get paid to do what I love to do. And that's the way we have to think, right? So thank you.
That's some excellent advice. So our next question is from Maddie, and she would like to know a little bit more about the designation of green infrastructure as assets in municipalities that you mentioned in the presentation. I think not all of our students are familiar with asset management and what that is.
Yeah.
So if you could give us just a little bit of background about what is happening locally or provincially, and exactly what does that mean, considering a green infrastructure as an asset?
So Ontario government has a regulation. It's called Ontario Regulation 588. You can Google it. This is a provincial regulation that is important in terms of asset management planning within the municipalities. When you are a municipal practitioner, you are a municipality, you have to work within certain standards to work on asset management plans and show those assets on your balance sheet. So when I'm talking assets, it could be anything: municipal infrastructure, arenas, community center, buildings. You have to show those assets as your financial assets on your balance sheets when you do your audits. Those are important pieces of your financial portfolio. Anyways, I'm going into finance, but just that's how it's built. But up until now, when municipalities did asset management planning, it was only related to hard infrastructure and assets, their vehicle fleet, their infrastructure, their equipment. Those were assets that they accounted for and reported on those assets. Like a certain municipality X may own billions of worth of assets, and that will go on their balance sheet. But what happened in 2017 and before that, as part of the whole wave of growth plan and climate change strategy at the province, somebody was really progressive and forward thinking, and they said, now you have to include your green infrastructure as in your asset management planning, and climate change in your asset management planning. So it's called the Asset Management Planning for Municipal Infrastructure, OREC 588. It was updated in 2017 to allow municipalities to think about climate change, I think, and also green infrastructure. So if a municipality has a huge park or big trees, you know, there's a specific, it's still an evolving field. Some municipalities are doing it. Others are kind of trying to figure out, how do I include that? Because there is no standard out there. So it's still an evolving field, but if you want to learn more about it, you can go there.
I'd imagine it must be very challenging to characterize, because unlike hard infrastructure assets where you know what the replacement cost is, it's almost undefinable to estimate a value of a green infrastructure asset. Like, how do you replace the Toronto Islands or the Niagara, Niagara Falls? Like, how do you put a dollar or a number to that? It's irreplaceable.
And you just raised a very good point, Jennifer, and that brings us to another area that I wasn't able to speak much today, is the whole initiative and the community of practice that is going on right now around quantifying green infrastructure and understanding the quantification of ecosystem value of green infrastructure. And I suggest students to take a look at, the Greenbelt Foundation, if that's the first place to go. They just produced a report recently, and they were able to estimate that, there's various studies, but this is an old study that estimated Ontario's green infrastructure sector was responsible for more than 120,000 jobs and really 8.33 billion in GDP in 2018, and those kind of stats are coming out. Ecosystem valuation methodologies are emerging. Ducks Unlimited has done some work. Pollution Probe, I think, and especially the Greenbelt Foundation has done some work in that area. There's also a Municipal Natural Infrastructure Initiative going on, MNEI, I think that's what they call themselves. It's across Canada, where they're trying to help quantify the value of green infrastructure. So there's a lot of research that's happening right now in that sector.
Yeah. So our next question is wondering whether you think we can expect that designing with LID will become the default in all infrastructure design, whether it be just locally in your region or more broadly in Ontario or Canada.
I hope so. I would love to, and I would love to see that through. One thing is very important to understand for students, and I try to differentiate that. Designing with low impact development is good for our urban areas to address urban stormwater issues. It's not a full scale, it's one of the many strategies. It's not a full scale strategy for any flood mitigation, large scale flood mitigation program, because when you're talking river flooding, you cannot address that with LID. However, I think it's an important first step in that treatment train process where you need to retain water on site before it goes into your river and stream. So LID, low impact development, is a very important first step in addressing that. Yes, I would like to see it common practice. I think the design guidelines that the province has for LID will help. But again, I think it comes down to local municipal official plans and policies that come out of those. And in the development planning process and the developers, you get some very progressive ones who are willing to do that, put an extra effort because they see the return on investment in the long run from a variety of perspectives. So I think it will be, I would like to see that. It should there's no reason why we cannot make it a common practice. We have to. We have no other option. Going forward, we must, as we are rebuilding. So I would love to see that happen, yes.
So the next question that I have is, particularly since you're from the Niagara region, you know, we talk a lot in this group, mostly centered around urban growth and urban development, but you know, our agricultural sector also has enormous environmental impacts, both to water quality and the overall water cycle, water balance, flow regime. So what are the opportunities or needs for integrating green infrastructure into that agricultural sector of our society? What is maybe happening in the Niagara area, or where are areas that you would love to see more like piloting and demoing to address that other really important land practice?
So there's lots happening across the province, especially in the region of Peel agriculture community in Niagara region. There's some very advanced stewardship taking place in the agriculture sectors, both from a water quality and water quantity perspective. So more so from a water quality perspective, because I think the issue of nutrient management from farming practices is an important one, especially for areas in Niagara where I am that are adjacent to Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, because whatever we do on our land goes into the water eventually. You know, we've seen the issues in Lake Erie with algae bloom and all kinds of things. So what happens on the ground in the agriculture community is very important. There are, you know, farm practices, farm management guidance, there's rural clean water programs. NPCA, my conservation authority, has a rural stewardship program where we help agriculture community with restoration programs on their site. We do understand, like I mentioned in one of my sites, that the agriculture sector does provide a vast amount of green infrastructure. We need to protect agriculture land for the purpose that they serve, and also for our watersheds, because these are big green spaces. Some of them are farmland for fruit trees, beautiful, beautiful areas of peach farms I see in Niagara, grape farms, and some simply grow vegetables and other, you know, crops, cash crops. So there's two things there. From a water quantity perspective, I guess they need to be greater stewards of land and the water courses that are flowing through agriculture lands. You have to understand, in rural communities, in agriculture areas, we have a lot of streams and rivers going through private land on agriculture lands, and it's important for you know, us to work with the agriculture community to make sure the form and functions of these water courses either remain the same or enhanced for better water flow, water quantity. At the same time, there's lots to be done, and some agriculture community is partaking in water quality improvement programs.
Great. Our next question comes from Daniel, and he's curious to hear more about specific flood protection programs or initiatives that are taking place in the MPCA.
So as you saw in the video, I don't know if Daniel saw it at the beginning, the flood management program happens at in various segments, I would say. The first and important one is updates of the floodplain mapping, to keep all your water courses, floodplain mapping updated so you can make the right decision and keep people out of floodplains. So we are in the process of updating floodplain mapping for all of our watershed. It's a 5-year capital program. Welland River was just completed recently. We're working on St. Catherine watersheds, Lincoln watersheds, and these are just in the process of being developed as I speak. So that's floodplain mapping. Then once you know where your flood lines are, what your buffers are, through the development process, like I said, with the agriculture community and residential areas, you need to make sure that floodplains are protected. And if people are doing things in the floodplain, we have the right regulation in place. And also we stop people through enforcement to do bad things in the floodplains, to keep people away and not building new infrastructure in the floodplain. So that's another program through development planning process, making the planning right. Now, on a different scale, it's also an important mandate of Conservation Authority to do flood monitoring and forecasting. And I can tell you, I think we are the first one in Ontario. We've come up with the application. I think your student would like to know that. It's called Alertable. You can download it on your cell phone, and basically in real time, it alerts you on water levels in Lake Erie and other water courses. And this is the kind of innovation that's happening right now. So we monitor water courses and Lake Erie shoreline. We issue flood bulletins, flood watch, to our communities and important stakeholders, to schools, municipalities, and other partners. We are working with Ontario Power Generation on the Wetland River to make sure they take water and, to generate hydro and to manage that. We're also working on making sure our flood watch along Lake Erie, we watch the weather, and we issue flood bulletins to alert our stakeholders on the risks. And then we have this app now, which is really gaining momentum. People are really liking it. And then we have a very vast flood monitoring network established across our water courses. We have rain gauges, flood monitoring stations. You saw it in the video. Staff collect data on a regular basis and use that data to make decisions. So it's a comprehensive multi-pronged program.
Yeah. So our last question for today is from Samantha, and she was wondering whether MPCA is involved in green infrastructure performance monitoring, and if there are any specific examples or projects that you're really excited about.
Thank you, Samantha. I'm sorry to tell you that NPCA as such is not, but I can tell you who is. 3 or 4 conservation authorities have a program called Sustainable Technologies Evaluation Program. It's called STEP. If you go online, you'll see Credit Valley Conservation Authority, Lake Simcoe Conservation Authority, and Toronto Region Conservation Authority, some of the big ones. They are involved in this program. We also have the province involved. They do performance monitoring on a lot of these type of projects, and there are a lot of engagement opportunities. I know students from U of T and Ryerson are already engaged because I spent quite a bit of time at TRCA, and I know those academic institutions work closely with us on that. So you can go there and get engaged.
Yeah, well, I think that's been an excellent Q&A. Thank you so much for all of that really interesting information, and particularly I think the question about careers, that was some really useful advice, about thinking from day one when you start your master's program, where do you want to end up, and how you need to build that network, and recognizing that there are no small jobs. It's really inspiring just to consider your 22-year career path, from tree planter to basically head of a conservation authority in one of the most unique regions in the province. I'd also like to say thank you to all of our audience members for very thoughtful and diverse questions and this sustained online engagement each week. I'm was not sure how well this was going to work out, and I'm very happy that it has gone so smoothly. This basically brings us to a conclusion. We'll please, if you have ideas or follow-up information or that you're looking for, or suggestions for next year's symposium, I'd be happy to hear ideas. And just to remind our trainees that the Design Live Summer School program started yesterday. You're not done with your online learning. You got one more month. But I'm really excited, as we sort of mentioned today. You've got STEP covering LID construction, and then we'll be learning about green roof construction, green roof construction, and green infrastructure soil design over the course of July. So, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Chandra. Have a very pleasant Wednesday to our audience, and that's it for our symposium. Have a nice day.
Thank you. Nice to chat with you, and thanks for having me.